Welcome to Matsuricon. This is like my favorite convention, so I'm really glad to see so many people coming out to see Evangelion stuff at Matsuri. Really relaxed con, really great. This is a panel about Evangelion and its impact on anime industry and anime culture, and also pop culture as a whole. I'll try to keep things even between the American and the Japanese sort of impact, so I think I might be leaning more towards Japanese impact, just because that ties more into where the anime is made and where those decisions come from. So let's get one thing straight. Rei's not Best-Girl. Asuka's not Best-Girl.
Yes!
Masato is not Best-Girl.
Where are we going?
Ava Unit 01 is Best-Girl. Now that we have that very important piece of business out of the way, we can get into the meat of the panel. What is this panel? This is not a fan panel necessarily. If you like Evangelion, you will definitely enjoy this panel. If you hate Evangelion, and there are good reasons to hate Evangelion, and I speak as someone who loves this show, you will still find a lot of worth in this panel, I think, just because it helps give you a lot more context and information on how Evangelion has changed the way that anime is made, the way anime is approached academically and culturally, and also in just things you might have seen that you didn't know came out of Evangelion. So I'm going to start this off like every good lecture starts off with a panel overview. The first part, we're going to talk about the context and creative genealogy of Evangelion, which is like where the show comes from, who the people who made the show came, where they came from. We're going to go into a section about what was happening during Evangelion's airing, the controversies and the production issues that came about during the airing of the show. We're going to talk about the anime industry changes. These are like the nuts and bolts. Here's what different shows are being made. Here's how different things are being done, and here's how we're making money differently. Then we'll talk about the cultural effect and legacy of Evangelion, which is going to a bit more into how has this changed the real stuff, not just how things are made, and why things are made, but the real deal. This is the important part of this all. So we're going to get started. Part 1 is industry context and creative genealogy, what was going on and where Evangelion came from. Oh yeah, I just want to say, 2 weeks before this came out, Digibro came out with an entire video on the impact of Evangelion, and I was like, damn it, no, why did he do this now? But I actually have some stuff that isn't in that panel, and then that isn't in that video, so, whew, that was close. So in the early 70s, actually up through the 60s and the early 90s, Evangelion was a little bit different from, not Evangelion, anime was a little bit different from how it is today. The subject matter of these anime was usually aimed at a very wide audience. There was very much an interest of saying, let's try and get as many people to watch our shows as we possibly can. We do not want to try and aim for a really niche genre market when we're talking about how can we get the entire family to watch our shows. This is primarily because they made a lot of money out of advertising and contract deals and merchandising. These were usually adaptations of manga and novels, mainly because they had a built-in sort of viewer base, and this is still true of a lot of anime nowadays, but it was not to the degree that it was back in the day. We did have a lot of original stuff coming out back then, but it wasn't to the degree that adaptations and long-running stuff of manga and novels were being made. Like I said, these were long runners. Often 100 plus episodes into a franchise, usually at least 50. If it was doing okay, you would get at least 50 episodes. That's why when you're going back and you're watching the old Gundam, there's always 50 episode, and they've kept that model since they're Gundam and they can do that. And like I said, they make money mostly from their advertisers and merchandise. So here's just some reference, just some examples of where that kind of comes from. These are all very influential shows in their respective genres and in the medium as a whole. I would definitely recommend checking some of these out, but I don't have time to go into. Here's what Lupin the Third is about. Lupin Third, people? Who's out here for Lupin the Third? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Good, awesome. Now, this is a different sort of market that they're marketing towards than the people who are buying and watching animated OVAs and films. Because OVAs and films were kind of where the genre market really thrived. It's where the more niche stuff was being marketed. This is where you got a lot of more hard sci-fi, hard cyberpunk, hard sort of weird fantasy stuff. This is things that they didn't have to market to a wide audience. They just like, listen, we know there's like 100 people who want to watch this show, and we'll make like a 40-minute thing for them, and they'll be able to buy it. And this often lent itself to being more adult. It had a lot more guts. It had a lot more gore. There was a lot of boobs.
Woo!
Yay, boobs! And they would often kind of go for that. Definitely that like a. I'm definitely not watching a kids show because this guy's arm just got blown off. That kind of vibe was what they were going for a lot in these OVAs and films. Like I said, it was marketed more towards an adult audience. You would often see films and stuff like that kind of maybe occasionally breaking into the mainstream, but not to the degree that TV anime were. They would often, like you would have those big things. Like obviously there's Akira, which was a big deal. There was the early Miyazaki stuff, obviously, which was a big deal but never really approached academically. It was more so just like, well, it's like this Disney movie. Like, you haven't watched a Disney movie, we all like it, but you're not going home and writing essays about it. At least we weren't until everyone who watched Disney movies as a kid grew up and went to college, and now we're all writing essays about it. OVAs and films usually made money from their just selling physical copies. This is where they got a lot of their market from. There's obviously some smaller stuff that they made money out of, like licensing deals. But it was also basically just like, hey, buy our super expensive Laserdisc set, and we will. Who remembers Laserdiscs? For example, Gundam wasn't even that popular as a TV series. It got canceled like a month before the end of its run, and it only became popular when it was released in this format of OVAs and films, or like free compilation films. So that gives you an idea of like how biased these markets were. Gundam, which was an original franchise with some very adult themes going through it of like PTSD and anti-war allegory. They didn't really hit its stride until they started going into this sort of market. For example, here's some more stuff over here, like Cyber City 080, 808, Raid or Die, Bow, Ghost in the Shell, Ninja Scroll, like so on and so forth. Merchandising. Now, I mentioned this in my Giant Robots panel yesterday. Did anyone go to my Giant Robots panel who was here? Awesome, good. I'm surprised you came back. So this is like the best part of being an anime like robot fan. The second best part. The first best part is watching giant robot anime. The second best part is owning owning toys of your favorites. So that's really fun, and this is also where a lot of shows got their marketing back in the day. A lot of them got their funding out of it, rather. These were toys usually aimed at a younger audience, which is part of the advertising. Like they wanted to get that really wide audience to be like, hey, buy our toys, buy our toys, buy our toys. Because this is how a lot of companies, especially Sunrise, have been able to fund all their stuff, is because they use these toys as a sort of cash cow. A lot of the story involved in these anime is often sort of serving the toys themselves, so which is why when you get through like halfway through a Gundam series, they'll always switch into a more powerful, more cooler robots. It's because, well, we've made all the money that we can out of these old robots. Let's market these new ones next. They were always like, hey, let's have this one-off episode with this really cool robot design, or let's have this character get like an upgraded show so we can upgrade weapon or mech, so we can start pushing more of that toy. Space ships, vehicles, and robots were the main store, like the main cash cow. You didn't get anime figures. You didn't get merchandise things of people's faces on them. And I've seen a lot of things with people with characters' faces on them. That was not a big thing back in the day. Like you did, yes, thank you. You have a theme going. This guy has like, the Shinji mug picture. He has like his entire outfit's based on that, and that's that's devoted. Yeah, thanks Star Wars. Star Wars was one of those things that really helped popularize the whole idea. Well, in Japan, it was a lot of Messenger Z was trying to push that, like the die-cast stuff as being a really big source of money. But Star Wars is another thing that really popularized that whole thing of, hey guys, you all like toys, and you like making money off of toys, right? And Star Wars was like the paragon, and has been for ages. And again, merchandisers had a lot of creative control. You brought directors on, but if they wanted to be like, listen, it's kind of weird that we have to change robots every like 13 episodes. Like, It'd be a lot easier if I could just focus my writing or my direction on just improving the characters and the story instead of having to set a plot of, and here's how the newer, better model gets in the hands of the protagonists. And the people who were giving out the money were like, nah, you serve us. Make those robots sell. And that's definitely where that came from. So, again, with some major exceptions, anime was not a force on the mainstream like it is today. This was often considered like a kid's thing. This is often considered like a weird, like nerd thing. Again, we had major influential pieces of animation being taken, coming out and being respected, at least at some level. Akira is often credited with helping revive the film industry in Japan, and that's definitely not unwarranted. So we did have some big name stuff happening out of animation, but it was not to the degree that we have nowadays. 1981 is when a group of students, animation students, made an animation studio called Daikon 4. And they, in 1984, is when they ended up changing their name to Gainax, which is, some little known studio that no one cares about, right? This was founded by 6 men, Yoshiyuki, I can never pronounce that name, Sadamoto, Yamaga, Akai, Okada, Higuchi, and Hideaki Anno. These were like the 6 progenitors of Gainax. They were very involved in a lot of the stuff that happened over the next 15 years that came out of Gainax. So they're kind of important. Like I said, they became Gainax in 1984. They renamed themselves. I think the only major thing that Daikon 4 did is they made like a really cool animation for a local nerd animation, nerd culture kind of con where they had a girl running through a bunch of series, and they'd have like things from Alien and Mazinger and Star Wars and stuff like that, and they'd pop up, and that was like Daikon 4's like big claim to fame. It's like, oh yeah, we did that animation, but they never really started really hitting their stride up until they started working on stuff as Gainax. And again, Gainax is kind of significant because they worked a lot on original stuff. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of stuff nowadays was heavily based on, it's just adaptations, which is something that a lot of people have noticed. The sort of, I'd put this. A lot of people nowadays are always saying, oh yeah, like, anime is not super original, they're never pushing out big stuff. Gainax did. They were the ones who started pushing out a lot of original stuff. They worked with a lot of really big name creators. They helped a lot of their staff work on things like Nadia of the Blue Water, which they worked on with Hayao Miyazaki. They worked on things like, I've got notes later, but we'll get to that later. I wanted to do this in about 7 minutes, but I have a lot of panel to get through, but it's almost 4:20, so I guess we can work with this. Anyways, we need to get into the actual staff and the people who worked on this. I love this image because like the more you look at it, the more you start to see more and more jokes that are inside of it. I'm glad about that. Smoke weed. Very nice. Okay, so let's talk about Hideaki Anno, who is possibly the most well-known figure inside of Gainax. He got to start working on Macross, which was like a show that was really made as a response to Gundam, and they wanted to be like, hey, what if we took Gundam and we made it kind of like silly and goofy, and I like idol singers, and it was great. And he started working on that. He also got to work on Nausicaa in the Valley of the Wind, which he did the animation for the God Warrior in that. And that was this big thing that pushed him into working with Hayao Miyazaki later on. His first directorial work was Gunbuster, which is something I waxed eloquently about in my Giant Robot show. Please watch Gunbuster. Then he worked on Nadia of the Blue Water. This is a reuniting with him and Hayao Miyazaki. And sidebar on Hayao Miyazaki, there is a sort of reputation of him being like a grumpy old man, the grumpy, charming old man. That does not really plumb the depths of what working with Miyazaki is like. People who have worked with him have reported like symptoms of PTSD and stress and anxiety after working with Miyazaki because he's extremely high pressure. Everything has to be perfect. everything has to be spot on, and you better be doing with hand-drawn animation nowadays. They specifically don't use digital animation, despite the fact that you can do a lot of really cool things with that nowadays, which is interesting. I want to keep that in mind as we're going into this, and I'm talking about like how after working on Nadia, this is when Anno fell into one of his first real years-long bouts of depression. I believe this one lasted about 4 years, is what he self-reports. And this is actually much better if I just speak this closely to the mic. And after working with Nadia, he was just so depressed that he ended up having, this had a major effect on his later works. And he has gone in and out of depression over the next 10, 20 years, but this is like the big one that really influenced Evangelion later on. Another member of Gainax's like old guard was Shinji Higuchi. He's the most senior storyboarder at Gainax, or at least he was until he split off and started working with Kara and people like that in the 2000s and 2010s. He also works a lot in practical effects for kaiju movies. So as I said here, he's worked on some Showa stuff. Not Showa stuff. He's worked on like kaiju movies. He's worked on a lot of like practical animation work, practical like effects work. So he'll have puppets that like make their eyes go left to right, and they'll like be really weird and creepy. He's really cool. He's also worked with Anno and Nadia and Gunbuster and Evangelion. He's continued to work with Anno in the future. He's worked on the Evangelion rebuilds, and he also worked on Shin Godzilla with Hideaki Anno. Has anyone here seen Shin Godzilla? Yeah, it's a pretty good. It's like Godzilla if it was like if it was a disaster movie. It's actually more so about like Hideaki Anno's frustration with the fact that poor disaster response stuff is just like killing a lot of people in Japan, or screwing things up in Japan. At least that's the way he sees it, which is why Shin Godzilla is more of like a disaster bureaucracy movie than anything else. He also directed the Attack on Titan movies that came out about 2 or 3 years ago. The final guy I'm going to talk about, because he's the one who pertains most to Evangelion, is Yoshiyuki Sadamoto. And he is the senior character designer for Evangelion, and he's continued to work on a lot of other stuff in the years since. Some of you might also know him as the mangaka for Evangelion, the manga version, which is a very good version. I think it's actually my favorite version of the series that's come out so far. It just finished, I want to say, 2 years ago, and has an actual complete ending that's not just like a middle finger, which makes it kind of weird in terms of Evangelion media. And he still works as a character designer nowadays. He has worked a lot on some recent Mamoru Hosoda works, like The Boy and the Beast and The Girl Who Left in Time, I believe. Or it could be a different one. Also, by the way, Studio Gainax were a bunch of animation fans. A lot of people have this idea of Evangelion being this big first thing that was like nothing else was ever like it, nothing else will ever be like it. It was completely original, but that's entirely wrong. Because they were heavily influenced by their predecessors, they built on their predecessors, and they really were able to infuse the works of earlier times with their own passion and ideas. So, for example, this is Ramiel. I think this is, I don't remember what episode this is in, 8 or 9, around there. 4. 4? 4 and 5. 4 and 5? Okay. Why am I even in this panel? Wow. Anyways, this is a reference to Super Police Uramashi, or Aramashi, I can't remember which one it is, which is like another weird, like, polyhedral alien dude that shapeshifts. It's very similar. Here are the Sele monoliths, which are pretty iconic. And these are a direct reference to this from 2001, A Space Odyssey. This was another really influential movie that came out. Star Wars was too, but also 2001, A Space Odyssey came out in the years prior to Evangelion. This was like a big deal of like, oh, you know what, it'd be really cool if we took the monolith from 2001. That was the evil dudes. Also, people have talked a lot about like, what does the crucifixion of Lilith mean, and what's all the crosses in Evangelion mean? Not a whole lot, actually. This is because, at least partially, Judeo-Christian sort of like imagery is used as a supernatural like shorthand to show that, oh, there's something kind of magical and maybe good going on. Because the general idea of Christianity is like, oh yeah, there was that guy who got nailed to that cross and he came back to life. That's cool. That's weird in the cult. That's weird. But this specifically is a reference to Ultraman, and specifically the series Ultra 7. In Ultra 7, there's an alternate universe where the Ultra Brothers, who are like these big transforming guys who like turn into big people who fight monsters and aliens, are all dead. And this is all happens, and they're kind of like enshrined / encased in a planet called Planet Golgotha. And if this isn't the creepiest stuff you've seen all day, I don't know what is. They were all like kind of chained to these sorts of cross-like things on a planet, and they were like kept there, and they're never getting away. It's really weird. I honestly I've always felt the Tokusatsu stuff is a little bit uncanny valley, but this is like the most uncanny of the valley. So narrative influences, there were a lot of these. Probably the biggest series that influenced Evangelion was definitely Space Runaway Ideon. Ideon was what Tomino worked on after he made Gundam, and it was sort of like a super robot show. If the super robot show was like a kind of like a fickle god, and it was all about like, hey, don't do war, don't do things like that. Basically Gundam, in that regard, and it basically ends with almost everybody in the main cast dying. Everybody dying, but it also ends in this sort of situation of a lot of people like being reborn and trying to figure out like, listen, the generations after us can help fix this. We can try and do better. It was a very optimistic ending, but it was also a very weird, semi-apocalyptic one. And this is something they specifically wanted to emulate in Evangelion. There are also a lot of ideas and concepts, like plot ideas and stuff that comes up in Ideon that I'm not going to go into right now because I've got limited time. But just know that Space Runaway Ideon is very much a grandfather of Evangelion. Devilman was a Go Nagai manga from the 70s, which is basically, I want to describe it as the Evangelion of Super Sentai stories, but actually Evangelion is the Devilman of mecha shows. And it's a very dark series, very much deals with things like the apocalypse and drugs and death and rape and some very uncomfortable sorts of situations. And it ends similarly to Ideon, it is a very apocalyptic situation, but it is very much less optimistic. Like Satan is crying over killing his boyfriend while angels cleanse the world. It is dark stuff. And not Amuro, I've read the next slide. Anno was like, man, I want to do that. That's cool. Gundam was also a really big formative thing for Evangelion and for Anno especially. Early series Amuro is very much